I don't know which screen it's recording. Doesn't really matter, does it? It's this screen. It's this screen.
No,
There you
it
can still
doesn't.
see it. Yeah. The way it's done, it's like if your name's on top of a pile, that means it's all your work. Okay, so you don't need to go through piles, but there might be several little piles of your work around there. I keep saying the word piles. You decided you want to join level 6?
Yes, I did.
Oh, really? Oh.
No, sorry. It's only going to be around soon, so I can collect everything. Don't worry about it. I was just wondering if people
Let's have a quick look.
Hang on, let me pick it and see what's. I might do myself back.
Yeah, that's why I did mine. We get what you first. Yeah. We have this long size pile. Middle ground. That's what you get. That's the trade-off.
I'm not looking back. Sorry.
Okay. Well done for coming back. You did come back. I'm very impressed. Before I put you up earlier. Hopefully, I mean, this is only an hour now, and it'll probably be a bit less. I don't know. Some quite heavy material. I'm going to try and make it quite light because, again, it's a kind of impression I want you to take away in a series of thoughts rather than any kind of concrete facts. I'm going to show you. We're going to look at the 19th century basically because we kind of ascertained that photography was already, right from the outset, thought of as a kind of description of truth in some way. It's a natural kind of really reliable copy of the world, and that was kind of unquestioned. So what we're going to do today is just to look at all the kind of implications of that and the practices that then came out of those ideas. But we also learned this morning that this is sort of complicated or haunted by art in some way, in an interesting fashion. So we're going to look at that as well. But one thing I want to point out is all these things happen in kind of instance. So when Victorians discovered photography and they're sort of enthralled by it, and then they start to discover that it has uses that, you know, if something hasn't existed before, you don't know what it's used for, so then it starts to be used for things. And these things happen, but the way we talk about them now is kind of informed by all sorts of things from our standpoint. So practices seem rather questionable, or like, you know, why would you use photography that, or why would you say that was true? So I just want to ask you to put yourself in the mindset of the people who are using the photographs in these ways, and to try and differentiate between when the sort of theorising these things from a contemporary standpoint. So all that stuff that David Bate talks about when he was talking about that library photograph of Fox Talbot, and he was drawing on Roland Barthes. Both Roland Barthes and David Bate are talking about something way after the event. I mean, Fox Talbot undoubtedly to make a decision as to where to place those books to photograph them. He was concerned with the amount of light he had in his library, probably, because it probably just wouldn't be practicable for him to take that photograph where he wanted to. So he had to recreate it. All that stuff about truth and artifice wasn't actually his intent. And there's certain practices that have taken place in the 19th century that seem really dubious now. And that's really interesting, but do bear in mind that it didn't necessarily seem dubious at the time. And that's a useful distinction to be able to make. I think that these questionings and theorisations are of the time too. It's just the actual photographs that are. I hope that makes sense. So there's a lot of slides to get through, but as I say, I don't want to go into anything too deeply. So it's almost like just let it flow through you, as it were. And then these are going to be on Moodle for you to refer back to if you want. I mean, first of all, was there any questions leading on from this morning, or any thoughts, any concerns, worries? Well, that's good, isn't it? Good. Okay. So, we kind of established that photography rapidly gained in popularity and as a thing, and technologically, as a result of the popular sort of the popularness of having a portrait taken. So all these studios suddenly sort of came into being, and so even by 1842, the exposure time for a daguerreotype had been reduced to about 30 seconds. Whereas 3 years before, it was when it was invented, it was more like 8 to 10 minutes. So things were really rapidly moving forward. So portraits began to be a lot more natural. People became more used to having these things. And this is a daguerreotype in its case. They had to be kept in these cases because they were incredibly delicate and a very kind of private experience, which is really interesting because, just as an interesting aside, Louis Daguerre was a kind of showman. He used to paint massive dioramas and then invite people to pay to come in and see them, like an early version of cinema. And he was all about like showmanship. And sort of kind of ironically, he produced this medium in the daguerreotype, which demanded that only one person could see it at a time. So it was a very private thing he invented. Whereas Fox Talbot, who invented the calotype, for a very, very sort of private reason, just to help him with drawing, ended up producing the thing that changed the whole world. So he ended up being the showman that Daguerre wanted to be. Because the daguerreotype, because it was so specific, it actually sort of died out quite quickly. I mean, it took it about 30 years to die out. And the reason it did die out was because of this kind of work. This is an albumen print, and this sort of format is called carte de visite. And this was invented by a guy called Disdairy, André Disdairy, and he developed a camera and a way of printing that could produce 8 portraits in a single sitting, but one after the other in rapid succession, and then they were just cut up, placed on these cards, and they could be mass-produced as well, because they were taken on a sort of glass plate negative. So these became really, really prevalent, and this was the kind of moment when photography became really, truly affordable for everybody. So even the daguerreotype was relatively sort of an expensive thing, even though it was within the grasp of people who couldn't get themselves painted. When it came to about the 1860s and 70s and the carte de visite, suddenly it was in the hands of everyone. It was a kind of democratization of the image. Whereas suddenly everybody could have a representation of themselves or of other people, which was beforehand not a thing. But what we notice, and this is where the kind of the haunting of art comes into this thing. So as much as this is a true kind of representation of this man, this gentleman, and we must remember that photography was very much still thought of as just a mute transference of reality into the image. But this is highly staged in order to promote this guy as a specific kind of, well, his social standing and his profession is being kind of symbolized by this set that's around him and the way he's standing, the way he's dressed. So even though it's just him, it's very much a kind of propaganda or a sort of advertisement of his social standing. And these what these cards were used for. And they became hugely popular because the whole sort of concept of the carte de visite was embraced by Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. And because these things were reproduced, this is the first time that celebrities, royalty, or whatever, found their way, images of well-known people could find their way into people's domestic environments. And there used to be carte de visite kind of albums where these things slotted in because they were uniform size. I should have brought some with me, actually, I forgot I was talking about this. So what used to happen initially, this was the kind of the very start of the family album, but pictures of kings and queens and royalty and sort of celebrities, people who were on the stage, tended to be put in the family album with members of your own family. So it was kind of all mixed up back then. So, but it can be seen as the start of both celebrity portraiture and the sort of family album itself. But you can see the kind of links back to this kind of painting tradition where the emphasis is on just showing how wealthy you are and what standing you are and what class you are. So as much as these are true representations in being photographic, they're still very much constructed, and there's no telling that the suits people wore for these things were what they wore every day. They might have put their very best. In fact, they would have done. And they may have even borrowed clothes to wear to make themselves look a particular way, or depending on their aspirations and what they were trying to do. So you can never just see these things as honest inscriptions of an identity. And again, we can see this kind of haunting of the past, of the art as well. So we have in the 19th century, we have the rapid expansion of manufacturing. We have emerging forms of state control of the body, which we're going to go into in a minute. The development of scientific disciplines and pseudosciences such as physiognomy, phrenology, and eugenics. So you have to bear in mind, we'll talk about what those are in a minute. You have to bear in mind that the Victorian kind of era was a massively progressive, and there was a huge emphasis on sort of empirical study, like the study of things in order to be categorized, and the emerging sciences, some of which were rather dubious, which are some of these, and they've been later thought of as pseudosciences, but at the time they were just sciences like any other. But the important thing is that photography found a kind of happy bedfellow with these things, because it was so unquestionably linked to true representations of things that suddenly it could be put to the service of scientific discovery, categorization, with no question that it was, a scientific fact. So photography was associated with realism. It was suited to claims of truth from the outset. It's like, remember all that stuff like nature and printing herself? The idea that there was a kind of mediation, and that kind of thing that I just told you to bear in mind, that mediation of kind of social standing, like of the portrait, where something's trying to be displayed in a particular way, that wouldn't have been explicitly acknowledged necessarily, even though it was an obvious thing that was being offered. It was more like what was popular at the time, what was making the most money, what did you want this thing for, but not in a kind of theorizing way. So photography was used empirically to prove particular data. That means it was used to test things out and to prove stuff. So the upshot of this is that as well as portraits being taken because people wanted their portraits taken, or were wealthy enough to have a portrait taken, suddenly there was a situation where not only was portraiture democratized in the sense that loads more people could then afford it, it was also imposed on certain classes who didn't necessarily want it. And this is the first time this has happened. So because you could see what a criminal might look like, or somebody who was ill or insane could be photographed. So these are daguerreotypes of a working class man, a working class woman. So these are people who are not being photographed because they've asked to be, necessarily. So, but there's also extended to photographs of criminals, and police forces started to collect together photographs that became a kind of rogues gallery, that they could collect pictures of known criminals. And it's interesting that these images, to start with, were very, very close in the way they were presented, in the way they looked, to the kind of honorific, more sort of commissioned portraits, because there was no kind of distinction at this time. So by the later 1800s, standardization started to come in. This is from Wormwood Scrubs. So you see they've adopted a very particular sort of format, using a mirror here for the, and the sort of placing of the hands to get a kind of standardized categorization of prisoners. But again, it's this notion that photography isn't lying. It's a sort of factual record of who we've got, in the same way as Talbot's sort of china cupboard. And it started to be used as a kind of evidence of certain things. So you have, but also in a kind of propaganda way. This is Henry Herring, who took a series of photographs of people convalescing and suffering from various mental illnesses. So it's a acute mania, so the kind of before and after pictures that sort of show the convalescent process and how that appears. But these are highly staged images. And highly coded as well, with all sorts of kind of middle class references going on. So it's not only reflected in the kind of posture, it's also reflected in the kind of props, books, the way that people are dressed. And this is a similar example from Bernardo's Charity in 1875, that I think even then were criticised as being rather fanciful and not really realistic in the depiction of how these children come from one situation and come out the other side being helped. But this gives you a kind of indication of the way photography is being used, the way it's being tested out to prove things or to demonstrate stuff. So these are two, John Tagg and Alan Sekula are two writers who in the 1980s, so this isn't happening at the time the photographs are made, in the 1980s they wrote about photography in the 1800s and realized this kind of paradox that it represented that I sort of mentioned, that it allowed the lower classes to become represented through the production of honorific portraits for the first time, but also for the first time provides a photographic method of identification, classification and control. So a newfound democracy of representation becomes also a newfound burden of representation, and that burden of representation is the book which, I think it's on the reading list, but I recommend you read that, especially the introductory paragraph, the introductory chapter is really fascinating. So you then have these two types of portraiture, which wasn't a situation before photography existed: honorific and subjugated. And the way that this tends to be talked about and theorized by people like Tagg, and this kind of notion that photography only gains meaning through the different discourses through which it's used, is very much related to Foucault, which I'm sure you come across Foucault in visual culture. Have you heard of the panopticon thing? Okay, so Foucault was a French philosopher who analysed elements of Western scientific discourse and forms of control. So his books include Madness and Civilization and Discipline and Punish. And he took this model of a prison design designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. He took from that a kind of symbolic meaning, and this was a prison that was designed so that it was designed around a central tower in which a guard sat, and the prisoners were situated all around the tower in a kind of circular sort of arrangement. But the thing that it meant was that the guard could see any prisoner at any one time, so they only took one guard. But also, crucially, the prisoners couldn't see whether the guard was looking, so they knew they were being looked at, but couldn't actually know when. And the idea was that kind of perpetuated or encouraged a kind of self-discipline, because there was no need to control all these prisoners, because they all controlled themselves because they knew that they were being observed. And Foucault takes that as a model for kind of society and surveillance in general, and this kind of burden of representation. If people know they're being catalogued, they know they're being observed, they know they're being recorded, they tend to be more wary of their own actions. You will cover that in various forms in visual culture and stuff, so I'm not going to go into that too much. It's just interesting to know, and that's how these things become kind of theorized. This is a particularly interesting collection of portraits that are kind of used by the police, photographs of known militant suffragettes, but they're all taken from various different kind of genres that existed at that time. So there's sort of studio portraits, sort of candid shots, and sort of mug shots, all sort of put in together, but used for this one kind of surveillance purpose. So the identification of people, for the police, for instance, became much more sophisticated, particularly through the efforts of this guy, Alphonse Bertillon, who developed a whole series of sort of categorization and classification. So the thing to take from this is this belief, or this use of photography to kind of catalogue and to make something that can be referred to as accurate data in relation to people. So what Bertillon ends up with these what are called Bertillon cards, and I think that's him. Yeah, that's him himself. He ends up with this kind of profile in the front view, but it's pretty much the front view is pretty much the same as the contemporary passport photograph. But these things didn't happen by accident. You know, that's the point. We tend to take these things for granted. But what's also interesting is that we still use those today, and they're still used, you know, legally as proof on passports, driving licenses, or whatever. So kind of underlining this continuation of the belief in photography as a truthful medium that will hold up in courts and at customs, etc. So the standardization for Bertillon, he was everything was accompanied by various measurements as well. So he was trying to get to this kind of complete standardization with as much information as possible. He didn't have fingerprints. That actually came a bit later, the fingerprint thing, which actually ended up replacing a lot of the data. But just consider, these kind of portraits, these kind of images are linked to photography entirely. There's no kind of photographic painted equivalent of these things. And this is purely because photography has this, or at the time was this unquestioned relationship to the true appearance of things. This is interesting. Do you know who Hugh Grant is? Yeah. So this is when he was arrested in 1995 for having sex with Divine Brown, a prostitute, in his car in Los Angeles, and this appeared in the newspapers. But it's just really interesting seeing someone who we were used to seeing through kind of celebrity portraiture and sort of candid shots. Someone trying to promote themselves through being surveyed is here, like placed in this kind of subjugated pose and in this kind of format. And it was interesting that the police, released this because they were, they had this policy of naming and shaming, so they were quite happy to let this out. So we have fingerprints. The fingerprints were actually, as a kind of method of identification, was actually developed as an idea by William Herschel, who's the son of John Herschel, who we looked at before, and the grandson of William Herschel, who was the astronomer who also discovered Uranus, as an aside. And here is a kind of first use of the kind of Bertillon type mugshot with the information with fingerprints alongside it. And this is by Cesar Lombroso. But Lombroso started using this stuff not just to categorize, record, but to somehow identify and prove certain characteristics, particularly criminal characteristics. And there became to be a belief through photography in a way that if you could picture criminals, then as a kind of science, you could identify what a criminal then looks like. And this is a kind of attempt at that. So by picturing enough criminals, you get an idea, that there's certain characteristics that are consistent. And there was a strong belief in Victorian times in this phrenology, which is the sort of shape of the head, and how that is somehow linked to inner kind of purity of class. So the belief was that there were certain types of poor people, insane people, criminal people. Their heads are different shapes to us normal people who are quite well off and quite educated and quite refined. So there was a desire to hold that belief. There was a desire that these things were different. They weren't just a set of circumstances that had befallen someone. There was something inherently wrong with someone who was a criminal. You could actually see it. So the phrenology was this thing about the shape of the head. Physiognomy is this kind of the external, it kind of privileged the external aspects of the body as indicators of inner morality. So photography fell very nicely into this. And there were a number of people who started using it. And perhaps the most sinister outcome of this was the idea of eugenics. And this was the improvement of the human race through selective breeding. And this was proposed by Francis Galton and he used photography to compare desirable and undesirable characteristics of breeding in the name of kind of purity of race. And this obviously finds its kind of zenith in sort of Nazism and the kind of their attempt to sort of eradicate Jewishness. So this started quite innocently, I guess, where Francis Galton initially started to try and demonstrate positive aspects. So a kind of a positive eugenics, encouraging healthy, capable people of above average intelligence to bear children, with the idea of building on those kinds of people, But what Galton did, which was kind of surprising now and really incredible, but it kind of reflects both an idea of what science can do, but an idea of what photography can do, and a kind of naivety, I guess, is Galton made these composite portraits. So he, in the printing, combined many different types of people into one image, with the hope of getting this kind of generic image of a certain type of person, with the aim of identifying those people and encouraging them, to not be in society. But it's just interesting to think, that this seems like some kind of crazy artistic venture, but this was actually being proposed as a serious attempt at bettering society. And again, it just sort of underlines that belief in photography and what, how seriously it was taken in terms of its ability to prove things. So this book by Havelock Ellis used Francis Galton's composite imagery as an illustration of what it means to be criminal. So he did this, with all sorts of stuff: health, criminality, sexual perversion, and Jewishness, amongst many other things. So, yeah, obviously that's quite a sinister thing, but so is this kind of photography, photography where the empire is colonizing the world, and with photography, images can be sent back of the colonized world as sort of foreign native types, and these have never been seen. Images like this, but they're made in the kind of name of science, hence the grid aspect. And I'm sure they were received in that way, but now they seem quite, very sinister. And there's a clear kind of disparity of power relations going on. You have the conquering white person photographing black people as kind of savages, they were, and then being brought back to enlighten and justify the sort of colonialism of certain countries. So it's very, very problematic now, but you need to understand that it wasn't necessarily that then, but it's very important to understand that it's the white colonizing Westerner that has the camera and has the power to take these pictures. So there's a clear sort of imbalance going on here. it also became prevalent in the 19th century for these images to be used as a kind of early form of pornography, even though that wasn't really acknowledged at the time. It was, these became sort of saleable items on that basis. So there was a kind of double sort of exploitation going on. So these are images made by Maurice Vidal Portman, and he made a vast sort of body of research into these people that he stayed with. But again, it's hugely sort of problematic, and reading these sort of volumes and what's attempted here is a kind of scientific categorization, a sort of classification system for effectively sort of savages by a sort of white privileged anthropologist. And these were kind of brought back to the British Museum or whatever, and effectively just justified and reiterated how civilized we were and how uncivilized the rest of the world is. It's interesting that he was using this sort of classification system that was actually the French policeman Bertillon had kind of developed. Yeah, there he is. I think this the Andamanese people are still pretty much so remote that they're not generally kind of integrated into any society. So you had this kind of colonial use of photography to record. Also, there was other sort of scientific attempts at sort of medical uses of photography, I guess. But this was Bertillon, Duchenne de Boulogne, who made this series of work, which was based on the producing kind of putting electric current through people's faces in order to demonstrate how muscles relate to the kind of inner soul of man. So these were published as kind of scientific medical journals. One of these was the expression of emotions in man and animals. So we also have motion studies. Now, most of you have probably heard of Muybridge. He was initially commissioned by a wealthy railroad sort of owner to settle a bet that, because there was no proof as to whether when a horse galloped all its feet left the ground or was maintained 1 foot on the ground. So this was something that was paid for by this railroad owner, but Mybridge set up this elaborate kind of experiment with tripwires so that as a horse passed by, many exposures were made, and this was actually this kind of the forerunner of the moving image, because you can make flick books of these things. The horse actually appears to move. So, I mean, there was a very kind of scientific and principled sense of inquiry there, and something was actually proved. But here again, this becomes problematic. Mybridge pretty much spent the whole of his life like creating these sets of images to record movement. And the other guy, Maury, we'll come to in a minute, but Mybridge pretty much recorded anything he could in this sort of supposedly scientific technique, but it's actually becomes more and more subjective. And again, this Ben Bailey character was the first coloured model that Mybridge used, and when he used him, this was the first appearance of these sort of gridded lines behind him. It's a kind of pseudoscience thing, but it's been criticised after the event that his choice of model was a sort of black man who appeared sort of very brutish and thick-set, whereas the kind of white males he used were very kind of athletic in a different sort of way. But once he'd adopted this kind of grid, which effectively just gives the impression of science, because there's no actual use in that grid, he tended to adopt it for everything. But then his things that he chose to go on to kind of demonstrate become so far removed from proving that a horse can run with all its feet off the ground. It becomes almost laughable that the sort of notion of science falls away really quite rapidly, and these become not only narrative but also quite obviously kind of with a hidden or not so hidden agenda, much more to do with the kind of male gaze and sexuality than the sort of desire to empirically prove how things happen. I mean, you can get from all this stuff that I'm delivering here what you will. It's just that kind of disparity, but also the fact that there was a belief there, and that with the value of hindsight, we can criticize this, but it's that belief is still current in many ways. And I think it's very useful for you to be aware of all this stuff that goes behind current beliefs. Etienne Jules Marais is not so well known as Mybridge, but his actual technique is much more scientific. He used one single plate that was kind of exposed in multiple, but very kind of regimented and measured time exposures, so almost like a strobe. So the actual way things move is much more measurable here, and he used to attach rods to people so that it became something that was more useful and less exploitative, I guess, or less subjective. But I guess all of this stuff is, you can look at it from a current perspective back, as with the value of hindsight, we can see this has been lots of stuff being tested out here in this century. It's also very hard to sort of forget the amount of technology we have and how easy it is to do stuff now. This also led on to the idea of scientific management. So this was something promoted by Frederick Winslow Taylor, and the aim was to improve efficiency from workers using sort of similar techniques to what we've just seen with motion studies. So photography was here used to rationalize and objectify skilled labor, and this was the kind of imagery made, you know, with a long exposure with kind of lights attached to workers' hands, so that what resulted was a kind of pattern that you could see that reflected movements, and then those patterns could be analysed, and any kind of excess movement could be identified and then rectified. So there's a famous image which I don't actually have in this one. There's an image of a surgeon working where he had to keep getting an instrument from like way over to one side, which actually ended up resulting in the use of nurses or whatever or assistants to hand surgeons instruments when they work, rather than them having to reach them themselves, which sounds really obvious, but apparently this was instrumental in causing those kind of realizations. But they're quite beautiful things. Oh no, here it is, this image. So I'm guessing it's that movement over to the left they managed to avoid. But these were often made into these rather beautiful representative sculptures. And it's interesting to kind of think about, if we're thinking about the relationship of truth to photography, what this in some way is a true representation of a series of movements put into 3 dimensions, with a very interesting relationship to the reality of those movements and to the photograph from which this has come. So we've looked now at photography as science, even though it's been a bit sort of dubious. There's been, and a bit hit and miss in the 1800s. Photography as art, as we've kind of alluded to, art kind of haunts photography. That there's always aspects of it creeping in, but also there were people who did take photographs specifically to be art in the 1800s. But they tended to be like paintings in some way. They tried, there wasn't really the idea that the photograph itself was art or photography was art. It was more like photography could be like painting and therefore could be similarly thought of as an art. And that was always hugely contentious. I suppose this, in the earlier 1800s or mid-1800s, this kind of manifested itself most obviously in these kind of multiple printing techniques, people like Henry Peach Robinson. So this is multiple exposures, multiple negatives put together to make a kind of tableau or a scene depicting a kind of, I don't know, moral or a kind of story, as it were. And these were often like really biblical stories. And these were generally met with quite a lot of criticism from the kind of academy art world. There was a lot of, what's the point of this? When it could be painted, and they just seemed a bit crass. But it's, these are amazing things, and that the amount of skill to be able to print. Because if you think each of those little figures is actually probably a different negative, all printed out into one huge composite, is quite an achievement. But they are slightly strange. So that was kind of how photography related to us. It kind of haunted all the images that came along, but it was still accepted as this kind of mute transfer of reality. But there was also these sort of attempts, but never really came to anything. When photography in the late 1800s, when it became so popular in terms of those carte de visite, and it started to be used when Kodak introduced their first sort of Brownie Kodak camera, which was the kind of the birth of photo finishing as an industry. So you could buy a camera, it had a film in it, and then instead of having to have a dark room or a studio, you could just use that camera, send it back to Kodak, and they'd develop it for you. That was completely a revelation, because before that, before about 1885, if you wanted to be a photographer, you had to be, either you had to set yourself up in business as a portrait photographer, or you had to be rich enough to have all the equipment and have all that time to invest in doing that. You had to be really kind of enthusiastic. Suddenly that was all stripped away, so you had all these ordinary people, or people who weren't that interested in photography, suddenly were able to buy a camera quite affordably, make pictures without ever having to deal with the chemistry involved. So the Kodak slogan was, "You press the button, we do the rest," and that was kind of revelatory. Pictorialism happened, and this was a kind of people in the photography business who were these kind of had a kind of snobbish attitude. They didn't like the cheap commercialization of portraiture that resulted in these carte de visites with people standing around with pillows and stuff. And these things were made very cheaply, and photographers set themselves up everywhere doing these things. So there were some really, really bad examples, which was very criticised in the kind of photographic journals. Bad examples of the use of backdrops, the use of props that didn't seem to fit, didn't go together, and they were all a bit sort of crass. And then on top of that, you suddenly had like everybody was taking pictures without any concern for sort of composition art or whatever. So there was a group of photographers that saw themselves as kind of elite, and they wanted to distance themselves from all this sort of crass commercialism. And they set themselves up as the pictorialists, which this was a response to claims that a photograph was nothing more than a simple record of reality. This was something that said, actually, no, photography is an art. We can show you that. We're going to sort of put ourselves above all this kind of use of photography that the portraitists do and the amateurs do. So for the pictorialist, a photograph, like a painting, a drawing, or engraving, was a way of projecting emotional intent into the viewer's realm of imagination. So this sounds great, but in fact, it was a kind of one-way dead-end street, because the way the pictorialists chose to do this was to simply mimic painting, to show how artistic photography was. They simply used, well, I say simply, but they tended to use things like gum bichromate, which was a very sort of soft jelly type of emulsion where images could be printed but then manipulated with a brush. So you get these kind of really moody, serious images. And this is the opposite. They wanted to say photography isn't just a science. It's this, but what this is actually quite flawed, really. I mean, having said that, this image is one of the prints of this sold for, I think it's the 7th or 8th most expensive photograph ever sold. Edward Steigen's Pond by Moonlight. I think it sold for $4 million or something. So so that's a nice example of pictorialism, but it's a kind of way of seeing the world that isn't to do with, it isn't helping. It's not strictly speaking photographic. It's photography trying to be painting, and it's trying to show the world as a kind of series of cliches. It's a bit like they're trying to be, Whistler, or some sort of painter who just shows, the natural world. There's no kind of gritty reality in this at all. Even a sort of modern skyscraper is depicted in a sort of moody, misty way. Okay, we're nearly there. Right, so I've banged on through science and kind of dabblings into art in the 1900s. In the early 20th century, this is a really significant body of work that was made, and this was made by Lewis Hine. He was a sociologist, and he specifically used his camera in order to effect change. And he did this for the National Child Labour Committee. And his images, he wanted to, this committee was set up because there was kind of concern that in America, factories were using children. And nobody would admit this. And no one, it was kind of an invisible problem. That it was there when you looked for it, but nobody bothered to look. And he looked, and he tried to get into factories, and he photographed children in factories. And the more he photographed, the harder he found it to get into these factories, because there would be like excuse after excuse, and that he was actually trying to trick his way into factory environments. He had these very sort of fleeting moments with children, you know, under the sort of watchful eye of foreman. He wasn't supposed to be taking these photographs, but they are absolutely amazing images. But the point here is that this is an attempt to document something, to make a change happen, and it worked. So this resulted in new legislation to stop children being employed in this way or exploited. So there's a slight difference here. There's still this Lewis Hine still, you can see in this the sort of roundings of what we call documentary, but there definitely wasn't that word being used. He wasn't interested in himself as a photographer. He was simply trying to show something that was invisible and make it public. And he was often doing it just as quickly as he could. I mean, he was using in this time, you know, like a 5.4 Graflex camera. So it wasn't like he was just nipping in with a small camera. But yeah, so he was trying to highlight this kind of exploitation. So these like sort of paper boys were sort of expected to be outside on the street, you know, in any conditions, day and night. Often they, you know, had no place to go or had to stay where they were set to work. Okay, but this is an important body of work in the sense that not necessarily when he took it, this work, as I say, it wasn't classified as documentary. This happened later, which is what I want to quickly get onto. And this happened in this exhibition in 1939. Lewis Hine's work was kind of discovered. By Elizabeth McCausland, and she exhibited this work kind of in a fine art context, but crucially, she uses this word, documentary, and she's also written an essay on what documentary photography is. It was kind of almost like a manifesto, a sort of call to arms to photographers. But she used Lewis Hine's work as an example of what she meant, and that's what she exhibited. And by the way, you can sort of see parallels in that work, you know, with this much more recent campaign highlighting child labour in the fashion supply chain from UNICEF. But I just want to touch on, I know we're over time, so I'm going to just go through this quite quickly. What Elizabeth McCausland suggested. So, as I say, she was instrumental in putting on this Lewis Hine show in 1939. And so she rediscovered him in terms that she described as documentary photography. And there is an article called Documentary Photography, which I will, I'll try and put up, I might be able to put the text online for you. I'll do that later. But this is sort of some highlights from this. So the rise of documentary photography does not spring from fashion. Rather, its rapid growth represents strong organic forces at work, strong creative impulses, seeking an outlet suitable to the serious and tense spirit of our age. Before the documentary, the technical capricci of Moholy Nagy, Man Ray, before the photograph and the rayograph, the photo secession, before that the pictorialists. What came of these? She's saying here that all this kind of art photography, even the sort of more recent stuff that we haven't looked at, like Man Ray, is a kind of frippery, a capricci, she puts it, you know. Why is that important? It's a dead end, it's nothing. So against this pattern of sterility of ideas, which could not reproduce themselves, we have the new function, and evolving from it the new aesthetic of documentary photography, an application of photography direct and realistic, dedicated to the profound and sober chronicling of the external world. So this is a kind of new set of language that's coming up here, where she's calling for this kind of stuff that Lewis Hine did to help overcome child poverty, child labour, misuse. She's seeing that as a kind of way to approach the world with photography. By virtue of this new spirit of realism, so notice those words like realism, so it's about truth. Photography looks now at the external world with new eyes, the eyes of scientific, uncompromising honesty. The camera eye cannot lie, is lightly said. On the contrary, the camera eye usually does nothing but lie, rationalising the wrinkles of an ageing face, obligingly overlooking peeling paint and rotting wood. There she's talking about those kind of artistic practices that she was disparaging. Today we do not want emotion from art, we want a solid and substantial food on which to bite, something strong and hearty to get our teeth into. Sustenance for the arduous struggle that existence is in eras of crisis. We want the truth, not rationalisation, not idealisations, not romanticisations. The truth we get from reading a financial page, a foreign cable, an unemployment survey report. That truth we receive visually from photographs, recording the undeniable facts of life today, old wooden slums counting on their foundations, an isolated farmer's shack, poor cotton fields, dirty city streets, the chronicles written in the faces of men, women and children. Actually, there is no limit to the world of external reality the photographer may record. Every subject is significant, considered in its context and viewed in the light of historical forces. It is the spirit of his approach which determines the value of the photographer's endeavour. That plus his technical ability to say what he wants. Now, this is really interesting because this is where it becomes problematic. Because she's saying she wants this sort of this true eye, like to focus on the world. But now she's talking about a spirit of approach, and she's talking about technical ability and a photographer's endeavour to say what he wants. Surely that's a kind of at odds, isn't it? First of all, there's no room for exhibitionism or opportunism or exploitation in the equipment of the documentary photographer. His purpose must be clear and unified, and his mood simple and modest. Montage of his personality over his subject will only defeat the serious aims of documentary photography. So I'm going to leave you with that as a series of thoughts. So I'm not reading this because this is like this is what documentary is. Go and make documentary children. You know, it's self-problematic. But you can see where it comes from, and you can see where its meaning to go. But it ends up itself as a dead end in a way, even though it's got the most noble kind of intent. And this is kind of expressed in this image, maybe. This is when this kind of embodies what we think of in terms of documentary. It's a really famous image. It was taken on bequest of the Farm Security Administration. The US government sent out photographers in order to document the poor situation farmers were in the Midwest. But this, in effect, was propaganda. It was done for a very specific set of reasons and sort of proposed redevelopment plans for these farmers. Plus, it's been evidenced, or this particular image has been criticised because this woman had many children, 6 or 7, and the image that was chosen to be used was the one that looked like the most standard representation of an American family. So this is somebody going out trying to solve a problem, trying to highlight some sort of thing, but there's other things at play that make this not strictly speaking honest. And to be honest, is there a way that you could do that? And there probably isn't. But the thing to know is that these things often appear real, and they appear truthful, and they appear honest, and they appear like they are unquestionable when they're not. So we'll leave it there. And we can go into the kind of problematics of that. There's a little bit more of this lecture left, so I'll start this next time, and then we'll be going on to look at deliberate kind of fabrications of truth, deliberate staging, deliberate use of theatrical devices, and how that can be seen as documentary, as well as this. Okay.
Before you go, if you haven't got your stuff yet, have a look around. Also, I think at induction, Jonathan asked if anybody was interested in